involves the posing of unanswerable questions. So I come without answers and without a doctrine, and above all things, I believe in the open question. I think great novels, great works of art don't answer questions that are important to us, and I think that's what keeps me alive, looking for somehow with a question. I remember in Camus, I think it's the myth of Sisyphus. He talks about how people say, why did this child have to die? Or why did these terrible things happen? Or why the earthquake? And Camus says, the answer is found in the silence of the spheres. And it's that recognition, that space between we desire the answer and the silence. And we have to identify ourselves, to choose ourselves, I think. I'm very taken by remember Havel, the Czech leader, and I've been some of us are particularly interested in him because when the communists were in Czechoslovakia and performances were barred or banned, they invented what they call living room theater, living room performances. And I was so affected by that we've started that in my living room. And some of you have, like one of our TAs here, who was a wonderful actress, Jean Taylor, did a one-woman show in a living room. And it went to about 6 or 7 different living rooms. And what I'm hoping for, what I keep thinking about, is a network of living room performances. And wonderfully, Gigi was at the Judson Church and met one of Havel's translators, which is sort of a wonderful coincidence, because I love that feeling of networking between what we do and what people in other countries do. I'm just looking for a quotation from Havel. I'll find it later, but I'm so fascinated by the idea. He says how we treat it as small screws in a big machine until something happens to awaken us. And if we're awakened, we're not only awakened to self-awareness, but to the sense of responsibility for others, for our community. I think at this time, with the election, I certainly feel better. If I hadn't talked here 6 months ago, I would be emphasizing the apathy of the American people, the sort of somnolence, the lack of concern. I wouldn't say that now. There's a kind of awakening that we all have some kind of hope for, not real confidence, but hope. And so you begin to see the way. For example, I know that Palin is by now a funny figure, and I know Tina Fey does a better Palin than Palin herself. But I think in her presence, one of the things many of us would, at least in my classes, I would like to do, is to make people look at those images that the media presents us, and it's a kind of Palin stereotype. Yeah. And I think one of the things we want to do is have people look at how they absorb, those images, so that children realize that people plan that kind of thing. Plan some image of what it is to be a good wife, or what it is to be an unfaithful husband, and I think that this very questionable image she's presenting should make people think, how did they impose images like that, and what are they? Is that natural, or is it created, or is it divine? I just keep imagining all these old men around the table saying, well, we'll have a hair this way, and there'll be a lot of them on television. I'm more hopeful than I was that we can somehow or another light a kind of flame in children, so at least they question, at least they feel alive. And I think maybe that's our main concern here. I always think that we relish beginnings at the Lincoln Center Institute, in part because beginnings are always open to possibilities. You don't know what will happen at the beginning. What's so wonderful? I think when you encounter an art form, it's always a beginning. Every time you see a Van Gogh, every time you even look at a Toile of Thaw, it's a beginning, and you can't ever repeat that experience that you have with a work of art. You know, it would be, oh, I heard that Mozart before, I don't have to hear it again. But there always has to be a new engagement. But first, even as we say, works of art are inexhaustible. You never use them up. But there's always a new way. You're different. The world is different. Hopefully, you're not stuck in one way of looking at the world. So the idea of a beginning seems to be very important. The teachers who come to engage in workshops conducted by people like you, by teaching artists, will come to experience, and I really prefer to say, participate imaginatively in performances and exhibitions, are in many senses beginners. And I keep wanting to emphasize that we're not interested in a passive appreciation. We're interested in what we talk about as a participatory encounter with a work of art. It's not simply moving into, but it's some ability. For example, we're having a workshop discussion next week about a book some of us have read, and it's called The History of Love. And it's one of the many, many books today that in one way are affected by the memory of the Holocaust. Not the Holocaust so much, but by the way you're sort of not inspired by, but filled by that memory which you never can quite understand. And it's about a manuscript that was lost because in the Holocaust. But there are figures, a little Jewish man in the East Side, a little girl named Alma, and you have the opportunity, if you know how to read, and I hope most of us do, we're looking through one perspective and another perspective and another perspective, and it doesn't come out as in ancient times, as a whole, where everything fits into everything else. You try to, the wonderful thing to me about literature is you end up saying, oh my God, what then? You know, it's not neatly put together like a box, so that that's what I think is always at the beginning. And I know when we talk about it next week, even though I've been at a couple of workshops, I'm beginning it again. You know, I'm partly affected by my having read it before and whatever memories I have, but it's always something new. the teachers who come here may well have been and probably have been to concerts or attended to classical and modern dance or wandered through Boma or the Metropolitan and learned some of the secrets of making and expressing themselves in art education courses. And we must assume that they know a good deal about teaching on whatever levels they've chosen or been assigned to teach. And today, as some of you know, many of them know a good deal about constructivism or multiple intelligences and the uses of narrative or the making of meaning. They know that in some way. And I want to make the point we made when we were together, a couple of us, a few days ago, the difference between knowing and understanding. Knowing has to do with the ordering of concepts and ideas. It may have to do with the determination of what I take it to be facts and the reliability of such facts. You knew what I was talking about when I referred to classical dance, and you probably knew the references I had in mind when I used the very term museum. But I want to make clear that we're interested in something that goes beyond knowing when we speak of aesthetic education and when we like to think of what teaching artists have in mind. We're interested in the nurture of understanding, and understanding involves not only recognition of the facts, whether we were watching a tango or a flamenco, whether the play Fly is a direct representation of what actually happened to Tuskegee Flyers. I can't help but think of something all of you probably know of Dickens' Mr. Gradgrind. He said, "Facts, sissy, facts." And Sissy had grown up in the circus, and she understood perfectly the appearance and the nature and probably the smell of a horse. But she could never reduce what she understood to the one dimension of facts that Mr. Gradgrind wanted to do. Mr. Gradgrind wanted a neat description of the horse, an ability to recognize a horse. But Mr. Gradgrind knew nothing about what it is really to understand a horse, to have felt the rhythm of the horse's canter, to smell it, to feel the sense of wonder and danger of riding a horse. All that is understanding a horse. And Mr. Gradgrind could only flunk her because she doesn't know the facts of a horse. It's one distinction, I hope, and it's one that William Blake, Emerson, and certainly Dewey understood. Dewey says at one point that facts are mean and repellent things. I sort of love him for saying that, until imagination opens the doorway of possibility. If the facts are just here, but it's what possibility opens when you go beyond. And I think that says again a good deal about understanding. And understanding, and I was thinking before, allows us to take note not only of the abstract knowledge we have, say, of Spanish dance, but it allows us to look at the skirt and the heels and hear the music and in some way seal that, feel all that in context on a foundation of fact. That's, I think, we all have to keep that in mind. And when I think of that too, I think of opening spaces for our teachers. This is one of our preoccupations here, how do you do something to make a teacher choose herself in an open place, away from the constrictions and the rules and the supervisions of the school? How do you do that? How do you open her? I'm very interested in imagination. I've written a lot about imagination, and many of us here think so often about it. And imagination, Dewey had one definition, which isn't a perfect one. He says imagination is the capacity to look at things as if they could be otherwise. And imagination has to do with the way things should be, the way things might be, the way things could be. But the imagination moves you beyond where you are to an idea of what could be. It also, and this is the danger of it, it also moves you from here to there to a sort of ghastly image. I just taught in my class, I have a teacher's college class, the book Blindness. Did anybody read Blind? It's talking about how imagination can summon up pure hell, but on the other hand, summon up an idea that is supported in psychology and history about the animality of human beings that underlies. And to imagine that is to move beyond but I think on the other hand, it moves beyond to some moment of freedom where you have to choose what it is to be human, to just go beyond what is. And when I think of going beyond, I think of a space opening up between what I am now and what I think I might be. Old as I am, I don't think I could live if I didn't think there was a space I could, like I tell people, the reason I want to live is there's so many papers I didn't finish correcting. There's something, a space between, and the most ghastly thing to me when I think about old people and the misconceptions of old people is it was just sitting there, crocheting or something like that, and it's without a sense of what might be. And it's harder when you're older, but nonetheless, if you have a project and you can't really give it up. It's the space. You can't lock yourself in. I try to look for metaphors like the windows of imagination, the windows that open up to the unexpected, to the possible, and aesthetic education for me is a mode of opening people through encounters with the arts to the possible in their own experience. I don't think, and I'm sure none of you do, that the arts can change the world or, create democracies where there are no democracies. But I do think, and I'm sort of obsessive about this, that the arts can awaken people. I talk a lot about a wide awakeness, and I get that in part from Thoreau, who I never met a man who was wide awake. This sort of desperation to awaken people, or from a philosopher named Alfred Schutz, who talks about wide awakeness, being alive to the world, noticing and attending to all the words we use in aesthetic education. And then I think of Paulo Freire, whom some of you have read, who talked about conscientization, a kind of critical with a critical awareness of yourself and your place in the world and the possibility in that world. I've been very interested in Paulo Freire, partly because I knew him for a little while, but interested in the way different, you would call them different lines of inquiry, started him going. He was a Marxist, existentialist, somebody who, God help us, was a community organizer. I wish he'd been here to hear that, because one of the most highly conscious things he could do, making people question, if you read it, you remember, internalized oppression. Women maybe know more of that than men do, but men also. The idea that you internalize the oppressor's idea of yourself, so that women for so many years thought of themselves as poor little helpless people who couldn't handle money, because that was your husband's view, that was the male view, and internalizing that kind of vision of yourself is crippling, and that was the kind of thing Freire was struggling against. And conscientization for him meant the ability to choose yourself. And then he talked about humanization, becoming. And those terms, that idea of becoming, of possibility, of openings, I think have an enormous connection with what we call aesthetic education. The last thing I guess I want to say is that when I talk to people, the problem I have is they don't understand the meaning of aesthetic. It sort of frightens them, I had a terrible experience a while ago. I had one of those things on my cheek that a dermatologist has, and so I was sent to a place on 66th Street, and there's a big awning, and it says Aesthetic Institute. But that meant Botox. When you go in, one side was Botox, the other side was the doctor who burns off. I thought, my God, what does aesthetic mean? And it doesn't mean something ridiculous like that. It also means something philosophical. Who wants to get involved with philosophy? So when I teach about it, I try to say, for me, the word aesthetic opens questions, it doesn't close them. It's like, how do I explain some of my responses to works of art? Why is it being very secular and not religious at all? When I hear something like the Ode to Joy, I suddenly think, where does that come from? That feeling of awe, that feeling of transcendence, those are kind of, when I read a poem by Elizabeth Bishop, and I ask, is that simply an expression of Elizabeth Bishop's depression, or does it go beyond? It's questions like that seem to be to define aesthetics, but I keep wanting to define it in terms of questions, not in terms of some Kantian abstraction, and I think that happens in the course of what we try to do in aesthetic education. I started out by saying we don't have doctrines, we don't have some kind of this is Lincoln Center, and we define that would be all. And every time as a teacher, a TA joins us, something new happens to what we mean by aesthetic education. Because what fascinates me, and I'm not an artist the way some of you are, what fascinates me is when the TA, the teaching assistant, confronts the teachers in a workshop, one of the things she's doing, whether he or she is asked to do it or not, is translating some of what her own creative process is into something people can understand who aren't artists. That's a very difficult thing, but I think that's what can be so wonderful about working as a teaching artist. How do you translate, how do you transform what you know or what you understand in a very deep way? How do you make that understandable for people who have not understood what it is? Like I try to tell people, I'm interested, as some of us are, in the idea of flow. You know, when you're creating something, I always tell students, you never realize that it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You get caught up in what you're doing. And I think we want, in some way, to help teachers understand what that is, and somehow or another communicate to their students the joys of that, and the ability to also undergo the disappointments, to realize that it doesn't always come out the way you wanted it to, but there's always another possibility, there's another day, there's another 4 o'clock. So I guess what I mostly want to emphasize is the role of openness, the role of imagination, and the multiple meanings of these things, and the idea that as teaching artists, and people like me and people like Maddie, all of us with different, what would you say, lines of inquiry, all of us coming from different directions, feel that we're always beginning. I know that we're not coming here with what's finished. We're coming here saying, would you like to be part of this process? And maybe something will come out of it that will change a few human beings. And sometimes I wonder, having taught so many years, what did I do with my life? I was into the lighthouse, Virginia Woolf's to the lighthouse, to Mrs. Ramsey, who's arranged a large dinner party, stands at the doorway and looks at the people sitting around, and she says, what have I done with my life? And I always think, if I ask that, all I can say, I hope I made a few people see differently. That's all you can hope. I don't know. I don't think I changed education or this or that. But 1 or 2 or 3 people might have awakened, and you can't ask for more than that. I better shut up. But thank you very much.
Maybe for 1 or 2 questions for Regine, and one.
I just wanted to say that there's a Chicago, what's the name of it? Chicago Institute, and they've been doing a magazine that some of you know about the teaching artists, which was founded by one of our former associates, and the Chicago Institute took it over, and now they're closing that institute. And the institute, they're starting, I think, a major research job on teaching artists, teaching artists, because they know, and I think I know, that teaching artists not only have a lot to say about this constant struggle to define art, but have a lot to say about teaching itself. The person to person, the translation of what you know into what you want other people to know. But I think we all ought to keep track of that, because there's a good deal that we people have been trying to invent aesthetic education and contribute, you know, to the other thing that seemed relevant to me. I suppose you did too, a long letter from the Rand Corporation, who are interested in the decline of audiences and so on. But they decided, after whatever research they did, the important variable was education in the arts. The reason why, you know, the audiences for philharmonics is that people don't know enough. You know, they're so affected by the media, by pop culture, so that they don't know enough. So part of our commitment is almost political, you know, to awaken people so there are audiences, and if there are audiences, I think there are fewer Sarah Palins, you know, if people are aware of these things. So Jose, it's yours.
So I'm just opening the room for any questions you might have for you. I'm putting you on the spot. Claudia?
In connection to how you described the urgency and necessity to look at how we absorb images, how do you feel that in relation to film? Because film is not a discipline in this aesthetic education. So how do you understand that, or how do you use film in context of images?
Maddie, tell me what she said.
She wants to know how would you study film in the context of aesthetic education?
Oh, it's so important to me in my classes. I teach a class at Teachers College, and it's called Education in the Aesthetic Experience. And we've been reading blindness and some, but I decided that one of the best things this week would be to use The Lives of Others. Remember that film? Partly it's a wonderful film, beautifully done, and it raises so many significant philosophical questions, but it raises them in the right way, because if you really participate imaginatively in the lives of others, questions come up that you never knew came up. If somebody saw The Lives of Others, what it's about East Germany and the communists who used as a sort of temptation or something that you can't act unless you do what the government demands of you. And there's the apparent hero of it is a playwright, and he is being very successful. And his friends of his who are trying to get in touch with Western talk about freedom keep saying, "Why don't you join us?" And it made me, and I think might have made you, ask myself, what would I do if they said, "You're not allowed to publish anything anymore unless you tell us who the spy is, you know, or who's betrayed." But I keep thinking, what would I do if somebody said you have to choose between your writing, your art form, your articulation, and selling out some guy down the street there's a very troubling article in the Times, I think today or yesterday, about Kundera, the Czech novelist that all of us thought of as a voice of freedom. And now they say he was guilty of betraying a classmate who went to jail for 14 years because of that, you know. And another one was Günter Grass, who won the Nobel Prize, and was maybe not his fault. He was a stormtrooper. And another writer I was going to use, but her book is out of print, Crystal Wolf, who also is, it is claimed, was was, told on somebody. And I asked myself over and over, would I do this, or could I do it? Or could I do it if nobody knew about it? But I guess what I mean is that films, like other works of art, would make them even more strongly force these questions on you, because it works on so many levels, the verbal level, the perceptual level, the emotional level. But I think it has to be crucial in aesthetic education. Do you, or are you hopeless about it?
No. It was just interesting to me, coming from theater, and that part of the aesthetic in the arts is that relationship between the audience and the performer in that communion, in that space. It's a communal experience, which is different from film. So I wasn't sure if you were considering film as part of aesthetic education, even though it doesn't have that.
We have experimented with film at the Institute, and Taro has worked on it, and we've stopped because there are issues with renting the film and getting permissions to use the film and getting people to see it in a theater rather than on a small screen, because if we're going to do film, we want them to have a large screen experience. So it's on hiatus for a while, but that doesn't mean that we might not consider it again. We did it on a very small basis the past few years.
So then based on what you're just saying, I'm sort of opening up a can of worms, that obviously we're seeing this aesthetic inquiry as embedded within a larger philosophical context. But are you saying that it implicates even things like ethical structures as well? Are you saying that it implicates those ethical structures?
Wants to know if the philosophical base of aesthetic education implicates ethical structures as well.
Very important. I think so, because again, thinking about the lives of others or others like it, an ethical choice demands that you personally have to decide between. Not everybody thinks that ethical choice is between good and bad. It's between good and good. How do you choose between your commitment to music and your desire to be a good citizen or desire to be loyal? And how do you choose? Now, for Dewey and people like that, you choose by anticipating the consequences of each thing that you do. I can continue with my music and feel like some kind of fake, because I know I'm living in an unjust society and I'm profiting in some way because I can get jobs as a musician. Or you can say, if I do that, I'm going to live my life with a feeling of guilt and insufficiency. Other people choose in terms of some principle, some abstract principle. It could be called justice. It could. Other people, like me, I guess, existentialists, choose without thinking of results. I choose myself in such a way that I can't betray my friend. Or like E.M. Forster, who was not an existentialist, said, if I had to choose between my friend and my country, I choose my friend. It's without definite. That I like best. I know all of us live by some kind of principle. I hope, that most of us think there's a line I wouldn't cross. In the lives of others, the representative of the society is sitting at a table with the actress, who is the main person, and he offers her that alternative. If you never could act again, will you turn in your lover? But you feel it in that. How does she decide? How does she decide? The principle says loyalty, fidelity. Another kind of principle says treasure your talent. Don't give up anything that But it's always open. It's always open. And I think in the last analysis, you just choose. But like so many, I've had all of us, and I was divorced years ago, and I can remember that awful kind of either or. I used to write pro and con on a notebook. You do this, you do, but in the end, you just say choose, goddamn it. So there's no easy answer to this. But I do think, that we can't forget it as we deal with the arts. I think there should be a kind of moral fabric against which we do our work.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you so much.
I always, when Mark Schubert, our beloved founder, was here, and I used to, after every speech, I say, was that all right? And when he died, we had a little memorial for him up here, and Beverly Sills was there. And I remember her sitting in the front in one of the biggest red dresses I ever saw in my life. And when I sat down, she said, it was all right. Anyway, I thank you for your patience, and I hope I see some of you at least again. Thank you, Matt.